Well, happy Friday. And as per usual, at least that seems like this is the pattern that it has been created without me trying, is that Friday I tend to do something a little different than or deviate from our Bible study. And so next week we will be talking about Revelation 13. But today I was asking the Lord all this week what it is that He wanted me to share. And a couple weeks or so ago, if you recall, I had taken some time with the Lord for a few days and just to take that week off and focus on talking with Him. Well, during that time, He had given me a message, and I thought that this particular message was for our church because we're going through a transition time with our pastor who's retiring, resigning because he's just ready to take a break from pastoring. And so we are getting ready to start the process of searching for a new pastor. And this message that the Lord gave made so much sense in that context. But then, as I was asking the Lord for what to share, He was bringing this back to mind, and I saw some more application to it. So I'm going to share. I have more of notes this time. So I know, based on these notes, that I'm probably going to have to do this in two parts because it is longer, but there's so much depth in what He showed me. And it all starts with because of the fact that I'm now doing all these studies and research into the botanicals. And every time I see something to do with trees or a plant of any sort in the Bible, it perks my curiosity. And so this is how it started. Was I was sitting on the bench with the Lord and asking the Lord what to read. And I happened to see my tea bag that I was drinking that morning, which was my Deborah tea. And I got kind of curious why it is that in Judges 4, Deborah is sitting under a palm tree and you see Gideon underneath a different tree. And I felt like there was some sort of connection. I began a deep dive study, and this is what came from that study. And boy, was I just overwhelmed with insight and revelation as I went through this because there was a lot more to do with the trees than I ever anticipated. So I'm just going to launch us into this study and pray that the Lord uses this to speak to you in some way. And I don't always know the reasons of why He puts these things on my heart, but I pray that it touches somebody who needs to hear this. So in Judges 4, as I mentioned, we see that Deborah is sitting underneath the palm tree. And if you watch my botanicals of the Bible, you've seen that that particular tree is the date palm tree. So it bears a lot of fruit. And the date palms have plenty of significance in that they are known to be symbolic of abundance and fruitfulness and flourishing. And so this is where she's sitting. But she's also here at the time that Israel is oppressed by the king of Canaan. But the people were still coming up to her because where she sat, she was visible. She was in between Ramah and Bethel, and we will get to a little bit more of that, but it was at a higher place. So she was visible, she was not hiding, and this is where she sat, and people would come up to her for her to judge fairly and righteously. So this date palm not only symbolized all the fruitfulness and the blessing, but it also grows in harsh conditions. So you have this date palm showing that very thing where leadership, the blessing and abundance of God is still flourishing, specifically in this leadership that is blessing God's people through Deborah. And still in the middle of the harsh conditions of being oppressed by the king of Canaan. Also interesting to note, if you hadn't seen these videos, is that the palm tree, this particular date palm tree, is the imagery throughout a lot of the temple. They use this pervasively. So it is very significant in relation to the spiritual sacred things. Now, where she sat is in between, as I said, between Ramah and Bethel. Now this is, Ramah means height, and it's 3 miles southwest of Bethel, and it's in the elevated territory of Mount Ephraim. It's strategic, it's spiritually prominent, and then you have Bethel, which is known, of course, as the house of God. And this is where there is a lot of history at Bethel, which I won't go into for the sake of time. There's a lot of fruitful agricultural territory here, and it has sufficient rainfall. Now, why I'm saying this is because there'll be an interesting contrast later on. So All of these little things are setting the setting and the groundwork for it. So here, Deborah is sitting beneath a fruitful tree in fruitful territory on the heights and near the house of God. And Israel sends to her for judgment, even in the midst of these harsh conditions that they're in. She isn't chasing leadership. God has put her there, and people have come to her. She arose because there was nobody leading, and so she arose as a mother of Israel. Now, 40 years later, Gideon, we see in Judges 6, there's been 40 years since Deborah's deliverance, and now with King of Canaan, and now you see Gideon, and there's great oppression again. Well, he is under an oak tree hiding. This is the contrast here that we see. Now he's hiding. He's threshing wheat in a wine press, because every time, this is something the Lord was talking with me, it's separate, is that every time that the Israelites were planting something or growing something, the enemy was pillaging it and taking whatever they were receiving, all the blessings they were receiving, they were stealing it. So they were not receiving anything. So this is why he's hiding, and he's doing wheat in a wine press. Now the tree he's under is the oak tree. It's a terebinth. It symbolizes endurance, strength, stability, divine power, and authority. It has very wide branches. So this is why he could hide under these wide branches. It is symbolically associated with the strength and permeates the endurance of Yahweh. So who is beneath this symbol of eternal strength is a frightened man. He is hiding beneath the shadow and strength of the symbol of God Almighty. Now, where is he located? He is in Ophrah. Ophrah means dust or earth. So Israel has become barren underneath this Midianite oppression. The Midianites have, like I said, they constantly are stealing and pillaging everything that the Israelites are growing. So Gideon is here trying to preserve the little fruit that he can possibly find. But not grapes in this wine press, wheat. And he is found in a barren place, lacking fruitfulness. Just the opposite of what we see with Deborah. Now, of course, God meets him there, because it doesn't matter where we are. Doesn't mean if we're in higher place and you have the strength and confidence, or you're hiding and you're trying to be unseen or undiscovered. God still finds the people he needs to lead, and he will raise them up. He knows their hearts, and he knows where he wants to take them. And he knows the potential that's in them, and he knows what they can do through God's power. So, on to our next point. In Judges 6, before Gideon can lead Israel, God has to deal with his house. So in Judges 6, Gideon's first battle isn't Midian. It's the idolatry in his own family. His father has the altar to Baal and Asherah. He has the Asherah pole and the Baal altar. So this doesn't mean that Gideon necessarily worshiped them or that he set up the altars. It says that his father did. But God would not share his glory. So there can be no suggestion when Gideon has these victories that the reason why he has the victories is because of his father's idols and the influence of Baal and Asherah or any other power. So these family ties to these gods had to be broken. And God's instructions here are explicit. He tells Gideon, tear down the altar to Baal, cut down the Asherah pole, and then use the wood of the Asherah pole as fire. And God consumed and destroyed that idol. So there is no compromise. The false god is not repurposed into worship. So it's not used, the Baal's altar is not used for an altar to God, to Yahweh. It is, everything is torn down, and then God consumes it. So Gideon then builds an altar to the Lord. So not using the same stones, not repurposing Baal's altar, he builds a new one to the Lord. Now this is important because in Judges 6, Gideon acts because God told him to. He feels weak, so he continually depends upon God's direction. But success will test Gideon differently than weakness ever did. In Judges 8, verse 22 through 23, we see Gideon, after Gideon's victory, Israel says, "Rule over us, both you and your son's son also." They want to turn that deliverance into dynastic human rule. And Gideon's answer is correct here. He says, "I will not rule over you, neither will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." But what Gideon says and what Gideon begins to live become increasingly contradictory in his life. Gideon begins looking more like a king. He has many wives, he has 70 sons, and then has a son through a concubine that gives him the name Abimelech. And Abimelech is a Philistine name, and it means "my father is king." So Gideon may have refused the crown, but his life increasingly bore the marks of kingship that he claimed to reject. And when the leader compromises, the people learn to compromise. And we begin to see this. So Gideon returns to Ophrah in Judges 8. But something now has changed, as we're already seeing through this. Gideon's story comes full circle. He began in Ophrah beneath the oak, weak and dependent upon God. Now he returns to Ophrah victorious, but we do not see him under the oak this time. Now Gideon asks the people for gold from the spoil, and he creates an ephod. But this time, God never told him to do it. And it says that this ephod became a snare to Gideon's family. So you compare Judges 6 and Judges 8 in Gideon's life. Judges 6, God gives explicit instructions and Gideon obeys. Idolatry is destroyed. Gideon depends upon God. Then in Judges 8, Gideon acts on his own initiative. He creates a religious object. It becomes a snare, and Israel goes warring after it. They are constantly looking for this. It becomes a place, like a Mecca, to keep going to as a religious idol. So earlier, Gideon leaned on God's own understanding because he knew that he was weak. He had no understanding. He didn't know how to do anything. But here, we do not see that. Gideon begins to lean on his own understanding instead of on God's. So Gideon already had an altar built in Ophrah that he had built to God. Why wasn't that enough to sacrifice when he came back in victory, to sacrifice upon that altar? Instead, he creates an idol, an golden ephod, something new, something religious, but he used something that was familiar as spiritual to cloak the pride in his heart. He returned to the place where God had commanded him to destroy an idol, and he erected something else that became another idol in the name of spirituality. Not an idol of Baal, an idol wrapped in religion. Do not manufacture what God has never led you to create. There is great danger in creating something that looks holy, that we convince ourselves he must approve of it, even though he never gave instructions for it. Now I'm going to pause here, and I want to pick it up in the next part, because something takes place after this. You begin to see more of the trees and how it ties everything together, and understanding how it applies to our life. So don't miss out. Make sure you click on the next one.